It's Friday, May 15th, 2026, and 5 days ago, the President of the United States handed his acting Attorney General a stack of news articles, the word treason written in a Sharpie on a sticky note. The result? Grand jury subpoenas to the Wall Street Journal and other newsrooms demanding reporters' records on Iran war coverage. Dow Jones called it an attack on constitutionally protected news gathering. The Committee to Protect Journalists condemned it. And somewhere in the metadata of all this, in the AI systems now processing communication surveillance, the question isn't just who leaked. The question is, who's watching the watchers? I'm Richard Schreiber.
Thank you, Richard. Tom Martin here. And this, as a longtime journalist myself, I can say this isn't a news story, but it's definitely an escalation. The Fairness Doctrine, which was repealed by Ronald Reagan in 1987, required broadcasters, or when it was in effect, required broadcasters to present controversial public issues with honesty and balance. When that standard died, opinion dressed as news moved in. We have all seen that happen. When that wasn't enough, the machinery turned towards the source. Intimidate the reporter, chill the newsroom, the machinery turned toward the source. As I said, dry up the well. Nixon tried that with Daniel Ellsberg. I think I'm old enough to remember that from my childhood. Barr secretly seized reporters' emails during Donald Trump's first term in office. And now there's a policy mechanism to enable it and a presidential Sharpie, as Richard said, to accelerate it. This is true journalism.
And our guest today, Michael Ashley, has spent his entire career exactly at this intersection, or at least recently. Forbes columnist, former Disney screenwriter, author of more than 50 books, 5 of them bestsellers, and the creator of the AI Philosopher, a Substack dedicated to what happens when technology meets human wisdom, ethics, and power. And as Tom said earlier, he is the right person for this moment. So Michael Ashley, welcome to True Journalism. Great to have you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with you guys today.
That's great. And a privilege to have you as well. Tell us a little bit about, we know where you've ended up, but what constituted your journey? You seem to have done a great many things, from screenwriting to journalism to now writing on AI and what's top of mind.
Actually, my background was in journalism. So my major in college was philosophy, but my minor was journalism. I went to the University of Missouri. They have a very famous film school. Journalism school. I also went to film, but it's very well known, and I feel very honored. Actually, what I was studying originally was philosophy and poli-sci, and I ended up switching my minor to journalism my last year in college. And they typically don't let you work for the Missourian if you do that, but the girl that I was dating at the time put in a good word for me, and I was able to do that. And they gave me the worst beat possible. It's for a very small town outside of Columbia, Missouri, but I'm happy to report that I was able to get 2 major stories on the front page because of a big thing that was going on regarding tax increment financing. Anyway, I feel very blessed that I had that background working in the newsroom and actually got to see how newsrooms operate, because I think it's essential to understand the way that the news cycle works. Some of the things that you mentioned before, the way that news gets generated is not this organic thing that many people think it is. It's very much top down. And in addition to that, we receive that in the forms of the culture and the society that grow out of that. The stories that we cover and the angles that and the way that they're presented very much influence what we talk about and the culture that we live in.
For sure.
Michael, I have to jump in real quick. And again, thank you for being with us today, of course. It's so funny. I have some friends, Richard, you probably have friends like this who are into astrology, or the reason we're in sync or whatever. But my parents met at the University of Journalism School in Columbia, Missouri in the 1950s. And one of their lifelong friends, who you might have heard of, Van Gordon Sauter, was like one of their literally lifelong friends. And so when I decided I didn't want to be a lawyer, what should I do with my life? He's the one I talked to. So there's roots in Missouri there. I majored in philosophy, and I never actually studied journalism, but I like what you said there. And I wanted to just dive in. There's so many things we could talk about. We could talk for hours here, obviously, with your many interests and your background. But when I first contacted you 6-9 months ago, when I was working on a project pitching a press release for an artificial general intelligence company, you said, "Oh, that sounds really interesting because a book I wrote years ago, co-wrote years ago, interviewed the co-founder of that particular AGI company." And so both Richard and I are totally fascinated by AI in many aspects, but you were certainly on that early cusp, right? How did that happen?
Thank you. Yeah, it's that book over here, Own the AI Revolution. It's his name is Ben Gertzlow. He's been on Joe Rogan and many other podcasts. I think he was on Lex Friedman's podcast as well. And I think it's important to note, I started that book in 2017 and published in 2018. As part of doing this, I worked with Neil Sahar. He was on the team that created IBM Watson. And so we're lucky to have 32 amazing people participate in the book. And was one of them. Other folks like Peter Diamandis was in it, David Hansen from Hansen Robotics. And I remember that I would come out of these interviews with my mind blown, and I would tell my wife, I said, "I can't believe what we're talking about." One of the things that we were talking about, because I remember I worked on this Forbes article with Ben a while ago, was what is now called Neuralink, the AI brain interface, and wrote an article at the time. Now, this was back in 2018 for Forbes. And I brought up this notion that has special relevance today. And what I said to people was, when people think about putting a chip in their brain, they're going to say no. But I want you to frame it this way. Imagine that you have a child and they're in the 4th grade, and you start hearing that all of their classmates, or several of them, have IQs that are north of 150, and you don't want your child to fall behind. I think it's human nature that the strong stance that we may have could very much be affected as you begin to look at the other people in the way that they're competing. And I think that's reflective of the idea that when it comes to AI, we're talking about the issues that really cut to the core of what it means to be human, and there are no black and white answers mostly. And it is a very nuanced, complex.
Yeah. I had the benefit of seeing another pantheon in the AI space, Ray Kurzweil, back around 2016. And he had just published, I think, his book on singularity, talking about, obviously, the advent of supercomputers thinking for themselves and learning for themselves, which is very science fiction-y, the Terminator and with Skynet and so forth. But yeah, all of that stuff just seemed to be out there. But since ChatGPT 2.0 came along in November of 2022, the world has changed because AI is now consumerized in the same way Steve Jobs did with the iPhone. But your Substack is called the AI Philosopher, not the AI Analyst. And you've said we need a philosopher in the room, not just a technologist. And I completely agree with that. When did it stop being a productivity story for you and become more of a power story?
Oh, that's a great question. If I'm answering this correctly, I want to back up and say something else, which is the reason why I think it's so important to have these kind of conversations, including the one that we're having now, is because we've seen the decimation of a monoculture. And so when I was still in journalism school, most people hadn't cut the cord on cable. We watched typically the same channels, not like we did in the 1960s when there was just 3 channels, but we largely participated in the same cultural conversations, movies, TV shows, bands that we were listening to. Mostly they were the same. That's not the case anymore. We have decentralized media. And although there are good aspects of it, it allows people to have unique, wonderful conversations like we're having right now, where you don't have to get past the gatekeeper to get on the air. But on the other hand, we're not sharing the same cultural touchstones. We're not talking about the same things. And right now, what I think the most powerful, the most impactful developments are happening in the world than we've ever seen in the history of the world. And yet we're not having these kinds of conversations. Right. Instead, we're all in our algorithmic siloed zones, right? And not only is that bad for the Republic, but it's also bad for us to talk about things that matter. And I feel like I'm straying from your question, but I'll say one more thing. I just did an article that's going to come out next week on what I'm calling the robot revolution. So this is, of course, AI revolution. And I want people to realize that in the same way, this juggernaut that you mentioned that came out in 2022 with ChatGPT, think about the ways in which it's impacted the world in just a few short years. But all of the AI that we've ever had has been disembodied. You would interact with it on the chatbot, maybe you talk to your phone or whatever. What happens when you're walking down the streets and there is a robot with an AI brain? And I'll go further. What happens when it's the server in the restaurant that you're eating? What happens when you're looking at a table and the person is there with his AI robotic girlfriend?
Something you know.
So That's a companion point. That's why I created this Substack. I have 2 young kids, and I want to be addressing these issues. To go back to what you were saying, if I'm answering this correctly, I write for Forbes as well, and I typically tend to focus on more of the nuts and bolts for the economy and things like that, although I do try to bring in philosophy. But for me, the beauty of this and the fun part for me as a science fiction fan, lifelong, is that I can talk about these things in a way that it touches what it means to be alive.
You know, and just to extend that, in The Day AI Got a Body, I think, which you wrote about precisely in this area, where you say that you basically articulate that this is a conversation that we're not having enough, that we have robocops in China, like the 1987 movie with Peter Weller, humanoid AI in the White House with potential teachers, AI-powered surveillance that we know OpenAI is going to be implementing on American citizens. How does this embodied AI change the government press power equation? I think it really puts a fly in that one, doesn't it? If AI can track metadata, communications, physical locations in real time, wow, it looks that presidential note with a Sharpie seems like a much older problem.
I think it goes back to what you opened with in your cold open a moment ago. I'll go one step further. The state has a monopoly on violence, right? And so what we've ever known, and it's not been very good, is human cops, human military that do things that we are not always fans of, right? You mentioned before from the article, there are robot cops in the streets of China. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to imagine a world in 5 or 10 years from now in which we have normalized that military operations as well as domestic policing operations are conducted by robots. You've probably seen the episode of Black Mirror where they have those robotic dogs that just won't stop. That's not just fantasy. That's completely possible. All you would need to do is with a drone that costs 30 or 35 bucks, you can use facial recognition technology and sick it on somebody and it won't stop. So you began this podcast talking about pressure from the White House upon journalists covering this war. That's nothing new. That's happened for decades, right? Now, what is new is the power to enforce these kinds of things. Technology is famously a double-edged sword. So it can be a wonderful thing. It could be a terrible thing. And when you begin to enforce policies, especially that are unconstitutional policies, with violence that is directed by not flesh and blood people, but robots. And let's remember too, the accuracy of a human being with a gun, despite all the movies that we've watched, is typically not very good on the aggregate. However, if you had an AI drone or a robot who had almost near perfect accuracy, it could be shooting down protesters or people that the state deems to be bad. You can imagine the way that you talked about earlier, a chilling effect. You have to imagine that would have a profound chilling effect. And my message to people, especially from the journalism aspect of it, is, unfortunately, we live in a very polarized time. And what's popular and acceptable with one president continues to the next administration. So I'll give you an example. People loved Barack Obama. He's considered to be a very popular president, and yet he codified a lot of wartime powers that we are seeing right now that I was never a fan of. The idea that there was a kill list under Barack Obama, okay, fine, he may have been popular at the time, but what happens when we have a president, I don't care what his policies or her policies are, then the next administration, they get to use those powers. And we've seen them, especially post 9/11. We live in a world that's vastly different from what it was pre-2001. And as time goes on and generations die out and new generations come in, they don't know a previous world. They don't know a time when you could go to the airport and you didn't have to have basically a strip search to get on an airplane. And I know I'm veered off from the original question, but these are some of the things that I think about.
I think I have a question for you, actually. A couple words come to mind: velocity and awaken and things like that. And so there are a lot of people who the pace of change, as you said earlier, is faster than I've only been alive X number of years, but it seems like it's the fastest pace of change ever in humanity. And so a lot of people just want to put the lid back on that. And we heard from some writers who write about AI, or movie directors like James Cameron or someone, or founders like who was one of the I forget blanking on his name now, but one of the early founders of AI, saying it's Armageddon or they need us to install the maternalistic instinct or we're all in danger. But a lot of people just want to put the lid back on this. But it seems to me there's no going back. But do we really need to awaken the citizenry? Woke is a negative word right now, but do we all realize things are happening? We can't just shirk our duty as citizens or something like that.
I think it comes back to civic responsibility. So I'm reading a book right now. I think it's called The Coming Wave. It's a gentleman that was part of Gate 9 and created that. And he brings up the containment problem. And he discusses the aspect that throughout the course of history, there's never been a technology that was very effective and helpful that wasn't accepted. You couldn't roll it back. He brings up the Gutenberg printing press, which at the time was a major threat to the elites. They liked the fact that people were illiterate. It allowed them to have tremendous power and control.
Yeah.
I'm going to close the door because my wife just told me to, and I hope I'm...
No worries.
It's interesting. And when I spoke with Michael a couple of days ago, you were not to shift gears. I want to hear the end of that thought, but
Yeah.
I also want to hear about the book that you're working on now, because that sounds very interesting.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. So he talked about this idea that you can't contain it. And I agree. And I think it'd be foolish to try to contain it. Here's why. It's not like the Manhattan Project where you had one dedicated group of scientists under government control and even that wasn't contained, right? Right now, the cat's out of the bag. Anybody pretty much can use these tools. You, for a very small amount of money, can get a synthetic biological kit sent to you in which you can dabble in genetics in a way that scientists could only dream of a couple of years ago. This is out here now. And so there is no putting it back. There is no way to contain it, in my opinion, even if we wanted to. And I'm not a fan of more laws. We have too many laws already. My suggestion, and it comes back to the book I think you're talking about, which has to do with parenting, is this. The problem I think that we've had for too long in this country is that we have a parentified nation. We expect our government to be mom and dad for us, and we are not acting as mom and dads for ourselves. And you can see it in the way that we raise our children. You may have seen this report that came out, I think it was yesterday, the dismal way that our children are performing across the board when it comes to education. And I put the blame not on the educational system, it's on parents. You go to a restaurant these days, and it happened to me yesterday. Look at the tables. Mom, dad, the kids are all on their phones. What message is that sending? Right? It's sending a message that it's okay to abdicate our role as responsible citizens. And we've done this for too long. If we want to have a world, it's a cliche that Gandhi said, but it's true. Be the change that you want to see. Get involved, learn AI, learn about these things and have an active role. Take part in our world instead of just tuning off and watching Netflix.
Yeah, that's well said. And as a parent, we really feel that. And it's a challenge. It's a problem. Kids are on their phones way too much. We've seen legislation in various states. I know New Zealand banned smartphones all the way up through high school because kids are losing that socialization, that interaction, that emotional growth. Obviously, COVID kickstarted that, and kids are a year to years behind in their emotional growth, and the cell phones people use in technology is only exacerbating that whole pattern. And you're right. We as parents are responsible for the development of our kids in the right way and to become engaged and to look at AI through a lens of being critical of it like anything else. Yeah. So looking forward to your book too.
Not at the risk of seeming like I'm going down a rabbit hole, and you can tell me if I am. I'm thinking, again, this is a generation of kids. I remember when the Columbine shooting happened. I have a friend in Connecticut whose mom who lost her little 6-year-old child in 2012, and kids in school, my kids are in their 20s now, so they weren't part of this specifically, but it's like practicing lockdowns, and then as well as the uncertainty of what's going on in the world. And it's hard, don't get Richard and I started on politics here, but it's like there's a sense of uncertainty in the world, and that must be the younger folks must be feeling that. It's just something to be concerned.
That's why there's a world shortage on Adderall, and so many kids report anxiety disorder, stress. And is there any surprise to that, given not only what's going on in the world, but they're incredibly agitated and involved state using technology?
Okay, I want to bring up that, and I like rabbit holes, so let's go back here. And not many people understand this or know this. There's a wonderful book, speaking of journalism, by Neil Postman called Entertaining Ourselves to Death. And if you read that, you'll learn that we used to be a mostly 100% literate nation. And what had happened was we didn't have this big budgeted Department of Education to oversee it. People were educated. How did they do it? They made reading a priority number one in their house. So Malcolm Gladwell talks about this in his book Outliers. He said the one thing that they can help to assure that your child will be literate and come to love books is that you have a house filled with books, right? You have to model that good behavior. That was now back in the 1800s or whatever. They didn't have as many books as we have now, but they typically had the Bible. They had Pilgrim's Progress. They had some other perhaps Shakespearean plays, whatever it was. And it was important to them. And they made that a priority. But the other thing that they did was they allowed the schools to be locally based. And this is key when it comes to boys and men. Typically, there were male instructors. Now, I have two little boys. My boys, one of them just participated in track and field day. That's where I was this morning. And I watched them after. You know what little boys like to do? They like to wrestle. They like to fight with each other. They like to run around. And you can take a boy that's 7 years old and you stick him in a classroom for 8 hours a day. I don't care how interesting the subject matter is. You are not going to contain that boy. And this idea that we could put a Band-Aid on him and give him Adderall is asinine, in my opinion. Instead, what we should be doing is leaning into the natural sensibilities of our boys. Let them run around. We were talking about physicality with robots. We need that as human beings.
Yeah.
Could teach boys, let them run around and experience the world physically. That's the way things used to happen. And then when they're worn out and tired, that would be the time when you can give them a book. You weren't talking about this, Tom, but I think it has a lot to do with Columbine and these other shootings and the ways in which it's exploding, no pun intended, in the zeitgeist right now. We are seeing violence. We're seeing all these upheavals because this system does not work. And when we try to force top-down educational mandates on our children, it doesn't work. Right now, we have a problem that our boys are disengaged in schools. And so they're not going to college. They're not earning the same amount that they used to. And it's a problem in the dating world. The women out there don't want to date these losers, and I don't blame them. And for their part, boys don't see any reason to get off the couch. They're living there at their parents' house.
Yeah.
The wonderful book called Men Without Work that talks about this very issue. And so this is part of, we're seeing this ripple throughout the culture. And again, I lay it at the feet of parents and culture in general. We have to model better stories. So it's Sapiens by Yuval Harari. And he talks about the importance of storytelling. We have got to tell a better story in America to change the behavior of the population.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you mentioned that because I'm working on some initiatives that actually use AI involved in storytelling, where youths can create their own characters, put them in their own situation, and then basically tell a story based on whatever direction their imagination goes. That might be the kind of use where AI and technology can still encourage kids to be interactive and at play. But I want to talk, that's a phenomenal subject matter. And we're all racking our brains. How can AI facilitate kind of a shift in our education system? Because colleges and universities, what they're producing in their old paradigm, in many cases, isn't really producing the kinds of opportunities for kids coming out of college. And you talk about in one of your articles, I know that up to 50% of entry-level jobs will diminish. I know Peter Diamandis is talking about 800 million robots in the workforce within the next 10 years. Back to our point earlier, kids coming up today, if they are learned, like my daughter is, she reads all this stuff. And it's, what kind of a world are they going to be in the next 5 years with this onslaught with AI and robots and everything? How can we as parents really encourage them and prepare them to be on the right side of the equation?
Again, I think it comes down to storytelling and the story that we tell. Let's remember, this goes back to the very beginning of this conversation. Let's think about the way the business model, the newspapers sell. Now I'm talking about the digital version or the physical one or just media in general. They sell based on fear being a primal emotion, right? And so if I were to open my YouTube app right now and I would go down and read them off to you, I would say 90 to 95% of the videos there are negative videos. They're using a headline to spike your cortisol, to make you feel and make you, I got to read this. I got to know what's going on, right? Okay, so let's counter that. You talk about and
we can't just throwing this in real quick. I apologize, but because I love social media, I confess. I was just watching, I forget if it was Jon Stewart or one of the late night hosts showing, it was like a replay maybe from, I don't even know what news network. But again, it was several days after that virus outbreak on the cruise ship, but it only affected a few people, but they were showing ambulances and the drumming music.
And totally non-communicable disease, and they're already drawing parallels to COVID unnecessarily and inaccurately, just to ramp up the news cycle.
Right. And it gets you more impressions, which means more money, right? So this goes back to what I talked about, personal responsibility, going back to storytelling. We, as a parent, my kids are 7 and 11. I'm not going to show them a Freddy Krueger movie at all, by the way, but I would definitely not show it to them before bed, right? You have to, and my kids want to watch other kinds of movies, and they ask me, why won't you let me do this? And I say to them, I'm your dad. I'm a guardian for your brain at this point in your life. I've seen these movies. I know the way that they're going to affect you. And even though you think it's cool right now, I promise you, I have to safeguard your brain so that you don't go to those dark places. Now, talking earlier about these young people, they're thinking about college. I was just watching this thing on CBS News about how fearful they are about this job market. Where does that fear come from? It comes from the narrative. And where does the narrative come from? It comes from culture. It comes from all of these different bastions, whether it's TV, the internet, whatever it is, right? And we have to remember they are going after the profit motive. And that's fine. Okay, they can do that. But what is our responsibility as parents? It's to safeguard our kids' brains. And and what I mean by this is, there's a quote by Albert Einstein that says, the most important philosophical question you can ask yourself is whether you think you live in a benevolent universe or not. And so if you believe as a young person that you do believe that you live in a benevolent universe because of the stories that you've been told, when you graduate from college, or even if you don't graduate from college, where you begin to go in your life will be predetermined by your outlook, by your perspective. And we have got to safeguard our brains. Right now, too many young people are getting their information and their news from their AI companions. And they're getting from these different YouTube channels and different things like that. And they do not understand the power of narrative, the power of information to work upon the psyche, and the way that it's changing how they view the world. And in some ways, we have to teach a new form of media literacy and to understand who benefits from these kinds of news stories. Yep. Block yourself, because I truly believe that the world will be amazing. I think that we're going into a new Renaissance era that we could never imagine before. But if you go on the news, you're not going to get that message. So it's up to us to put out good information and to safeguard the information that's going into our minds.
I saw a stat that surprised me, and that is 40% of people get their news almost exclusively from AI. And AI has no kind of guardrails, controls, ethical considerations, or anything that we who went to journalism school were born with. Not to say, and there are still plenty of good journalists out there who I believe abide by the journalism code of conduct, or whatever you want to call it, that we all studied back in the days of Ed Murrow and whatnot. But AI has no such considerations. And there's a lot of deep fake stuff out there that, to your point, is just ratcheting up anger just to get clicks. Has nothing to do with being informative.
Can I have one more thing? Going back to that line, who benefits, think about this for just a moment. When it comes to the public models, they typically cost, some of them are free, but most of them cost $5 or $20 a month, right? Why are they doing that? Who benefits? Who benefits is these major companies are pursuing the singularity that you mentioned earlier. They are AGI and ASI. How do you get there? According to their logic, you get there through training on data. We are once again the product, right? How do you get someone to engage longer with their product? You get them emotionally connected. How do you get them emotionally connected? Get them outraged, get them upset, get them feeling like they need to be on this. It serves their ends, which is fine, but we all have to remember what's going on, and so we make better choices.
Or they're using AI as a friend or companion, like you mentioned earlier. AI has been used more and more now as an emotional crutch. In some ways, it's helped because at least it's someone who listens and doesn't say bad things.
With Scarlett Johansson, that's not science fiction anymore, right?
Sure. Yeah, it's not. Exactly. But also, but think about that for just a moment. Mark Zuckerberg famously said that we all need an AI companion, an AI friend, right? So you're mentioning the movie Her, which to help preview this moment, it's real now. But what happens to a society where people, men or women, are finding companionship in a disembodied AI or or an embodied AI in the form of a robot? Largely, these models are trained to be affirming, again, because we are the product and they're trying to get more data out of us. But more importantly, if you think about the relationships that we're in, they are mirrors. They teach us our vulnerabilities. They teach us the bad things about us. I'm sure that our partners would tell you they're people and they've helped us. Like, AI girlfriend isn't going to tell you your problems, right? You're going to grow. Your soul isn't going to grow. And eventually, if we're not careful, we will look at population collapse, that people don't start families.
Wow. So I want to follow up on what, again, parents can do. And you made a comment that we should stop raising obedient workers and start raising entrepreneurs, because AI automates compliance, but it doesn't automate judgment. That's still our purview. Let's apply that to journalism, though. What does a reporter or news organization that survives the current moment, what do they look like going forward under that same scenario?
This is a wonderful question, by the way. So what I would say is when I was going through in the J school back then, the hope was that you would get hired by a newspaper and you would work for them. They were paying basically 13 an hour, which is, you can't live on that, right? And so many people hoped that they would get this job out of college. But what if instead you thought to yourself, now that we have agentic AI, they can essentially be a full-time employee for me. And the technology has been democratized so much that even if I'm a journalist and I didn't go to school for computer programming, I could set up my own AI journalism company. I wrote about this for Forbes. I call it the micro enterprise model. And what I say to people was, in the 20th century, size was a proxy for power. You had big companies like GE that were so powerful because they had a lot of people working for them. Right now, you can have a company of one that can compete on the market. So imagine, let's say that you wanted to cover sports. Let's say that's your niche for journalism, right? You don't have to wait for Sports Illustrated to hire you. Start your own company. And by the way, you'll probably be a better journalist than many of the ones out there that are beholden to making money. They go to the White House press correspondence dinner and kiss to whoever. Forget it. Have your own virtue, have your own standard that you live by, and then create your own company that lives by those standards.
Yeah. So well put. So you're right that AI is a philosophical mirror. It reflects back what we value, what we fear, what we haven't been honest with ourselves about, to examine this closer. The DOJ story is also a mirror, looking into it. What does it show us where journalism is right now? And that, of course, is the story about the subpoenas triggered by the president, who is apparently against fact-based and truthful reporting, that whenever it's inconvenient or doesn't represent his best interests.
I have my own problems with the president on that, but he's not the only president who's done something like that.
Yeah, LBJ did it, of course, during the Vietnam era too. Yeah,
Bush did it as well. Let's look at the way that he went after the people that were protesting the second Iraq war. Let's look at the way that Obama was going after journalists who weren't on board with the Syrian airstrikes. So that's been on for a long time. But I want to take issue with the journalists themselves. And it goes back to my comment about the White House press correspondence dinner. When I would watch those events year after year, and I noticed how chummy they were, it upset me a great deal. One of my heroes is Glenn Greenwald, and he's for a long time and Jimmy Doris, another one, has brought the ways in which journalists have failed at their craft. They have abandoned their ethics. They should be taking power to task. They should be fighting against power. It seems to me that we would not be in this place we are in now if it wasn't a slow degradation of the ethics of our journalists year after year. Instead of combating and holding our leaders to the fire and pushing back on them, they have been happy to be on Air Force One with them, to go to the Met Gala and to participate in the parties. They are not journalists. They are stenographers. And what I would suggest is we have to go back to what it means to be a journalist. It means not being friends with your source. No, it means doing the hard journalistic work, because if journalists were stronger, they would not be able to be bullied by this administration or another administration. And I think that it's reprehensible what Trump is doing, but it's equally reprehensible what journalism in general has done over the last few decades.
Yeah, we need more journalists, Dan Rather and Sam Donaldson. Right, Tom?
Yeah, no, I was going to jump in, and I appreciate that you phrased it like that. I think that's a very important point. Again, I grew up in a journalist household. My dad was a newspaper editor, and he was very inscrutable as far as, no, we can't accept the free tickets to that, because we can't, we don't. And so now, and then I think back of so many examples you could choose, but for some reason I'm thinking of Brian Williams. He said, I was on that flight. Yeah, I did that. So you're boasting about I am the celebrity, which is the Anderson Cooper, but now he's hosting the annual New Year's Eve. It's like, there's celebrity.
Yeah.
It's out of kilter.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to our ethics as a society as well. If you think about who used to be our heroes, it used to be religious leaders. It used to be poets. I think the award for, I don't know if they discontinued, but at the beginning of the 20th century, do you have a poet laureate? We don't care about those things. It used to be novelists. It used to be thinkers, intellectuals, artists. And instead, who do our young people want to be? Influencers, right? Vapid influencers who are just famous because they're famous, right? And Kim Kardashian and Paris Hilton, they paved the way for this, right? And so there's substance behind them. And that paved the way for people like Brian Williams and others to pretend to be a journalist or whatever, but really they just want people looking at them because it makes more money and there's nothing behind it. And again, I go back to our values, especially parents. We have to tell our kids, you can do better than this, than just being someone looking at you and you do dumb things on YouTube. You're better than that.
Yeah.
As Mr. Beast said, oh no, sorry, go.
Mr. Beast. I was going to say, in the classic true journalism close, if Edward R. Murrow were alive today, watching the entire arc of our AI consciousness to embodied robots to a president writing treason on a sticky pad, what do you think you would say to a young journalist sitting down to write their first story in 2026?
I don't know what he would say, but here's what I would hope he would say, which is this. Things don't have to continue the way that they are. Anything can change, but it begins with the individual. And so we may look at all these things out there and be dismayed, disappointed, upset, and that's good. That's fuel. But it doesn't mean that they have to continue. And it takes just one person that says no and doesn't go along with it. And fear is contagious, but so is bravery. And so one person acts brave and displays standards and ethics, that shows an exemplar to someone else, and they begin to emulate that. And I think that is how you turn this around.
I agree.
There's still room for a Rosa Parks of our tech age.
Of course.
Like that. I like
Yeah. Even in our politicians today, we see a few islands in the mix that are standing up for what's truthful and what's right. So we'll see. All right. This is a part where we talk about the top 5 propaganda stories to wrap up. Michael, you're welcome to stay with us. So we talked about the Trump treason Sharpie note, that the spin on that was investigating criminal leaks that endangered troops in the field. That's what AG Blanche said.
Who Attorney General Blanche is Donald Trump's former criminal defense attorney.
Exactly. But the subpoenas target reporter records on a risk assessment article published before the hostilities. There's no specific factual error in this story actually identified. It's crazy. And then we talked earlier about the Joint Chiefs when they warned regarding General Dan Kane and the Pentagon officials warning Trump of extended campaign risks 5 days before the war campaign. This was reported by some reporters, maybe at the Wall Street Journal, and now they were subpoenaed for basically saying what was a fact-based comment made by the president's own cabinet. Pam Bondi's DOJ reversal, restoring the DOJ's ability to protect national security from criminal leaks. So basically any news story that gets out there that's contrary to what the administration thinks is consistent with its narrative is now called a criminal leak. And again, you mentioned earlier that Attorney General Bill Barr secretly seized reporters' emails during the first Trump administration. This new policy allowing subpoenas is just another pattern of executive press suppression, now across 2 terms, and it's, as we know, getting worse. And then we talked about AI surveillance, targeting journalists, tech companies providing law enforcement tools to the government or to governments under national security authority. The IFJ, which has over 600,000 media professionals in 148 countries, documents AI systems combining telecom data with drone feeds to identify and track journalists in conflict zones. 128 journalists actually were killed in 2025. Spyware and AI surveillance targeting journalists is on the rise. Crazy stuff. And then finally,
and I think this is really important.
sure.
Yeah.
There is a game that's being played on the American public. It's been going on for a long time, but it's the duopoly. It's this left versus right issue. And so what I want people to understand is that every 4 years or so, we get to kick out the other people and bring in someone else. And it comes down to identity politics. The things you're talking about, I'm not in favor of them, but they're not a large departure from the Biden administration. This was going on during the Obama administration, the Bush administration. And what happens is it's like spectators at a sports game where we want our side to win and we think the other side is bad. But what's going on right now is this is vested power.
Yeah.
The amount of executive orders that go through every administration is astonishing. The founding fathers could never believe the ways in which power has been consolidated to this level. And I think it's a mistake that we label this as a Trump problem. Of course,
No, it isn't.
problem in some way.
Yeah.
This was a Biden problem too.
Yeah.
And what I would suggest to, especially to parents as well, is to help your kids understand that these issues continue administration after administration. And the only way that they're going to change is at the systemic level. It's not by voting in the Democrat in the elections. And it's about changing the way in which our republic is governed.
And we mentioned in the past, Michael, that under the Clinton administration, more young Black Americans were incarcerated under the war against crime.
Yes.
And under Obama, more immigrants were expelled than any other administration. Now, Barack Obama was a very effective administrator. One could argue that his efficiency was the reason behind a lot of those numbers. But yeah, to your point, these are things that are not politically oriented. It just so happens the guy in the office now, yeah, he's doing his own flavor, his own version. But you're right. This has been going on and it crosses political lines all the time.
Thank you. And it's because I hear it so much and people get so caught up in the personality of whoever's in there. Think about the excuses that were made about Biden's ability to run his administration. Anyone with a brain knew before he was elected, he was not capable of being president. They threw him to the wolves in that presidential debate, but the press corps had been covering for him for years. Yeah. And it's, speaking of an embarrassment, the journalists who now act, oh, he tricked us. We thought he was so
Yeah.
Come on.
Speaking of covering, and again, this is from when I was 2 years old or whatever, but John F. Kennedy, there were some things going on in that administration that journalists, we're just not going to talk about.
And of course, there was a different decorum back then, but I think also that time in America, what we benefit from, we had a strong culture, right? And so we could allow these shocks to the system. Even with the protests in the Vietnam War, we were largely grounded. We had a monoculture, but that has completely collapsed in America. Yeah. And so if you combine that problem with an unhinged president, with a war, goals and objectives have never been explained to the American people. And I don't think it's a legal war. I don't remember Congress voting for this war, right?
Nope.
So all of these things are going together. But I think the mistake that we make is when we identify it with one person, is if that person is the first person to do this, right? It's going on administration after administration.
Indeed. So, Michael, you walked in here as a philosopher and left us as Exhibit A in the case you've been building, that the most dangerous thing AI can do isn't to replace us. It's enable the powerful to erase us. And the work you do at the AI Philosopher, asking questions the tech press won't ask, in the voice of a journalist who's been in the room, is exactly what journalists' oldest mandate demands. So we thank you for your pursuit, the fact that you are an ombudsman extraordinaire, and we need more people like you for certain.
Thank you. As a journalist, as a parent, as a tech aficionado, you brought some amazing ideas. I would really enjoy this conversation. Where can people learn more about your writing and your books and so on?
Thank you both. Those are very wonderful compliments. The AI Philosopher is available on Substack. I write a column for Forbes every week. It typically comes out on Wednesday, but you can look me up there. And then if you want, just reach out to me on LinkedIn as well.
Excellent. Excellent. And again, Richard, you mentioned we're all, every episode we mentioned Edward R. Murrow, and Edward R. Murrow built his career asking one question: is what you're being told true? I love, Michael, you were reminding us of that, the importance of journalists who step up and citizens who take responsibility as well. But Michael, your tools we're in at this different age. We keep evolving. Substack, AI ethics instead of the Joe McCarthy debate and so on. But that remains the same, as you said. It's continued over the different administrations. Years. The Fairness Doctrine was killed in 1987, so power can operate without a mirror. And your life's work, which is so impressive, and you've got so many more books ahead of you, I'm sure, is holding that mirror back up to us. And that's why I love our conversations. Really appreciate the work that you do and the ideas that you shared with us today. So thank you again.
Thank you. Honor, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So to close, this week, a president wrote treason in Sharpie to subpoena a newsroom. AI surveillance tracked journalists in a war zone. 40% of the country is now getting its news from an algorithm with no accountability standard. Apply the sticky note test. Name the specific fact that was proven wrong in what you're reading. And if the answer is nothing, you know exactly what you're looking at. Build your foundation on that question, and we'll see you on the next wire.
Thank you.
Thanks again, and in the words of Ed R. Murrow, good night and good luck.